Good evening, everyone. My name is Faith Williamson, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Here at the Institute, we strive to educate, empower, and engage individuals in a productive dialogue aimed at increasing active civic participation and strengthening involvement in our democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political ideas or candidates. Tonight's conversation features Gary Ginsberg, a lawyer who has spent his professional career gaining experience and making connections in the worlds of law, media, and politics. Mr. Ginsberg started his professional career working for the Clinton administration, was then a senior editor and legal counsel at the magazine George. Following this, he went on to spend 2 decades in executive media positions at first News Corporation, then Times Warner, and finally SoftBank. While in these positions, he also published many pieces in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, as well as writing his first book, First Friends, the Powerful, Unsung, and Unelected People Who Shaped Our Presidents, that reached the New York Times bestseller list and is the main topic of our conversation tonight. First Friends details the lives of 9 presidents, spanning from Thomas Jefferson to Bill Clinton, and more specifically, the friendships they relied on while they were in office. Mr. Ginsberg delves into these relationships in each president's respective chapter in the book and offers insight into just how much influence friends can have on a president, their administration, and even the course of history. We are very pleased to have Mr. Ginsberg here tonight to engage in a conversation with the Institute's Executive Director, Neil Levesque, and student ambassadors here today. And we want to sincerely thank him for coming.
Thank you, Faith. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming, Gary. I think this room is great to have you in because there's so much presidential history around the room. And of course, you were deeply involved with several campaigns starting in '84 with Gary Hart.
Yes.
And you worked for Bill Clinton, obviously, and Al Gore.
Al Gore. Yep.
And I think that that's the interesting thing about this book is that you saw some of these close friends of presidents up close and personal.
I did.
But I think the most telling thing in the book is your experience with the vetting of Al Gore
Yeah.
and Harry McPherson and what he said to you. I just want you,
Sure.
you can go through that.
Sure. I'm often asked, what inspired you to write this book? And I literally woke up with the idea in April of 2018. And I said, oh my God, I got to write this book. Just kind of came to me. And I've been trying to kind of deconstruct where that idea came from. And I think one of those moments that I had really not thought about for quite some time, this happened in 1992, is what Neil is talking about. I was vetting Al Gore for the vice presidency. I was actually part of a 5-lawyer team that was sent to Washington in April of 1992. I had been the first advance director for Bill Clinton. I was a lawyer in New York City, probably going nowhere, frankly, as a lawyer. And I got this call out of the blue saying, do you want to go down to Little Rock and run, start up Governor Clinton's advance team? So I did that for 3 months. And then I think the campaign knew I wanted to do more than advance, which is what I had done in '84 for Gary Hart and partly in '88 for Al Gore. So 5 lawyers convene at an unmarked office in Washington, and we start the kind of tedious process of vetting potential vice presidential candidates. We got a list of 50 people that the governor, because the governor knew everybody, as you know. And so he had 50 people he wanted us to look at. And so we were assigned names, and I had worked for Al Gore in 1988. So I said, I want Gore among I think we were each given 10 names. The 10 that eventually my 10 got reduced down. The 50 got reduced to 20, got reduced to 10, got reduced to 5. And I was given Al Gore as my final candidate to really go deep on. The governor had decided he wanted to interview 5 people. So I spent 3 weeks really going deep on Al Gore. I went down to Nashville. I called everybody. I wrote a lot about Gore during that process. We're about a week away from the big interview, and the campaign really shrewdly decides that instead of a 29-year-old former underling to Al Gore to ask the really hard questions, because you don't want to make a mistake when you're picking a vice president. The Democrats had been,
Take it back.
you can't take it back, and the Democrats had a horrible experience in '72, if you remember, with the senator from Missouri. Why am I forgetting his name? Tom Eagleton. and then in 84 with Geraldine Ferraro. And they didn't want to make a mistake in 92. So there's a lot of questions you have to ask a potential vice president. So so the campaign decides, rather than having me ask the hard questions, they would have a 70-something-year-old kind of gray-haired political veteran,
Harry McPherson.
Harry McPherson, who had been Lyndon Johnson's counselor and speechwriter. So he calls me up and says, can you come down to my office and just show me, let's talk about what you've learned about this guy over the last 3 months. So I dutifully come down to his office. I have reams of papers. I sit down and he says, put away your notebooks. I want to know one thing about Al Gore. Does he have any friends? Because it's not clear to me that he does. And I said, wow, you don't want to know about greenhouse gases. You don't want to know about his father's Arm& Hammer stock. You don't want to know about his votes on MX missiles. No, I want to know who are his friends. So I said, well, started to think about it. I said, well, he's got 2 members of Congress he's quite close to and his brother-in-law. And he says, well, who else? And I'm thinking, my God, I traveled on this campaign for months. I was with him all the time. And I couldn't remember that kind of gaggle of friends like I saw with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had the fobs. I don't know if you guys remember you're too young, but
we've had the friends of Bill Clinton here for an anniversary of the primary.
Is that right? Oh, how fun.
And they all came up.
Oh, so you know the story.
And there was a book written about them and everything.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, he had 600 friends sign a letter. 100 friends came up to New Hampshire and knocked on doors. He told me when I interviewed him for the book that, but for his friends, he would not have been elected president. So I'm juxtaposing my experiences working on the Clinton campaign with Al Gore, and I realized he doesn't have friends. He has 2 members of Congress and his brother-in-law. So Harry got really perturbed about that because he had worked alongside Lyndon Johnson during the height of the Vietnam War. And he had come to realize that the lack of a first friend, and he said it was a first friend. I think that's the first time I heard that's where the title came from. The lack of that first friend, he thought, had a really deleterious impact on Johnson's presidency. And he worried that if Gore, a heartbeat away from the presidency, didn't have that first friend, what could it mean? So we go to the interview, and sure enough, right off the bat, he asked that question. And Gore, just as I had suggested, named 2 members of Congress and his brother-in-law. And Harry said, well, wait a minute, anybody from Carthage, from Nashville, from Harvard, from the Army where you served? Gore said, no, Tom Downey, Norm Dix, Frank Hunger. Everything else was great, passed the exam, obviously, but we got back in the car to drive to his office, and it was just bugging him. And I know he called Warren Christopher to bring it up. I asked Bill Clinton when he called me about my book in July after it came out. I said, was that an issue for you? And he said, Gary, I had enough friends for both of us. It was not a concern.
So one of the factors is that you obviously highlighted a series of presidents, but some presidents, as we know, don't have that person. You mentioned LBJ. Ronald Reagan famously did not have a first friend, but he had his wife who kind of stepped in and did that. Right. So it must have been hard sort of trying to pick who these folks were going to be for the book.
Well, I decided that I defined friends in a very narrow way. I didn't want friends to include close family because, frankly, there have been books written about first wives and the role of first wives. And I didn't want to include staff because I think that both family and staff have a different quality of relationship with a president-to-be and a president than does a friend. If you're staff, you serve at the pleasure of the president or the candidate or the senator, or whatever it is. So there's limits to what you can really say or do because your job's at stake. And if you're family, it's just a different I mean, I think you all can relate, right? I mean, we all have friends. We can all appreciate the role friends play in our own lives. And so it's really no different for a president. So I defined it so as to exclude those first wives or chiefs of staff, et cetera. To choose them, there's only one president I could actually ask, and that was Bill Clinton. So I did call him up. I explained the book. He really loved the idea. He said, I need a couple of weeks to think about it. I think there were 3 people he was considering, in addition to Vernon Jordan, Terry McAuliffe being one, and Bruce Lindsay being the other. But he said, I want to go forward with Vernon. And I was quite delighted because I'd already interviewed Vernon when I first came up with the idea. For Kennedy, he too had a lot of close friends. I was very friendly with Kennedy's son and became very friendly with Kennedy's daughter. We went to law school together. So I called up Caroline and I said, who do you think was your dad's first friend? And she said, I'm going to give you a name you've never heard of before, but it's going to take you 48 hours to figure it out. But once you do, you're going to thank me for this name. And I think she was dead right. I picked David Ormsby Gore.
Who, by the way, when I got to this chapter, I said, even though I'm in this business, I'd never heard of him.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, it's the person you never, and he wasn't even an American.
He was not. He was the British ambassador to the United States. But what was interesting is that Caroline got to know him. She spent a gap year in London and then went back and forth. He died in 1985, so she knew him. And her mom had obviously talked a lot about David Ormsby Gore and his wife, Sissy. And it was one of the great examples of where a friend both provided that respite, that recreation, that humor, that enjoyment that we all have with our friends, but also that intellectual component where he made John Kennedy a better leader, a better foreign policy leader in particular. So it had to me kind of both the key ingredients of what a true first friend can be and do for a president.
So the best quote, I think, to sort of describe what these people do is Hillary Clinton said, Bill or any president needs someone that they can totally relax with, share a joke,
Yeah.
someone to go on a
Right.
golf course, talk about anything of significance
Right.
if they choose. And I think that sort of rounds it out, that when you're in this kind of pressure cooker of the presidency, somebody you can just hang out with and not have that pressure.
Exactly.
Some of the presidents that you picked have these strong relationships with friends, but also I've noticed that their wives, their spouses both the president or the friend does not have a good relationship or a strong relationship with the spouse.
Yeah, it's a very good observation. In some cases, I think the best friend replaced the spouse. I would say Bibi Rebozo, who was Richard Nixon's first friend, really kind of played the role of both first friend and essentially a stand-in spouse. I think Nixon preferred the company of Bibi to Pat. I think Pat acknowledged that essentially. There's a quote in my book to that effect. I think with Franklin Roosevelt, his wife essentially was estranged from him beginning in 1919 when she discovered an extramarital affair. And during his presidency, she really used the role of First Lady to crusade for her causes. And so she was away from the White House for vast stretches of time. And that's why I write about how lonely Franklin Roosevelt was, because his kids were either fighting a war or didn't want to be in the White House. His wife is away. And he said to Daisy Slickley, I'm either exhibit A or left entirely alone. And he did not want to be alone.
And it's amazing that they were going to build a house together, the cottage.
Yeah.
He was designing it.
Yeah.
I mean, this was his mental escape, essentially.
Yeah.
And very affectionate. There's plenty of people that have speculated further, and there's a movie, obviously, with Bill Murray that sort of really went over the line. But they don't, some of the people the presidents are describing, they actually use words like, I love you.
Yeah.
To people of the same sex.
Yes.
Colonel House, for example.
Colonel House. Colonel House was an example, actually, where I think the second wife, immediately sensed that she was going to be fighting for the affection and time of her new husband, now the president. And so she, I think, orchestrated a campaign from the moment she became part of Woodrow Wilson's life to excise Colonel House from his life and from her life. And you have to understand, if you read the book, Colonel House was not only Woodrow Wilson's closest friend and only friend, but also essentially ran the foreign policy of the United States during the entire period of the First World War. It could not happen today. He was at one, and I start my chapter by saying he was at one and the same time the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the head of the CIA, the head of presidential personnel, no accountability, no Senate confirmation, no security clearance. And to your point, was an intimate friend of Woodrow Wilson, short of anything sexual. I don't mean to suggest that. But they wrote in the most intimate terms to each other, expressing love, expressing gratitude. Same thing if you look at, so many of the letters I think I found, particularly in the early years of our country, men, the way you would communicate with your best friend if you didn't live next door was through letters. And so we have so much to go on. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison exchanged 1,250 letters between them. And so you get such a great picture into the complexity and depth of that, both friendship and collaboration.
And of course, Speed.
And Speed.
Joshua Speed. And, there's been so much speculation about Joshua Speed
Yes.
and Abraham Lincoln
So much.
sleeping in the same bed
Yes.
for 4 years.
Yes.
Obviously very strange dynamic there, but normal for the time period. One thing I found really interesting is Abraham Lincoln, we all think of as obviously the president that saved the nation over an issue called slavery.
Yeah.
And his best friend
Was a slave owner.
is a slave owner
Yeah.
and a trader and just an amazing dichotomy there between
It
two groups
is.
of people.
But consistent with Doris Kearns Goodwin's take on Lincoln, which is he liked to have rivals. He liked to have people with different points of view. His best friend, as Neil was pointing out, was named Joshua Speed. He was a storekeeper in Springfield, Illinois. And Abraham Lincoln shows up in Springfield as a brand new lawyer. He's looking for betting and he doesn't have any money. And he says to the storekeeper, Speed, how much is betting? He says, it's $17. And Lincoln says, I don't have the money. So Speed says, go upstairs. I've got a double bet. If you like it, it's yours. So Lincoln walks up the staircase. He looks at the bed, puts his satchel down, walks back downstairs and says, Speed, I'm moved. And for 4 years, as Neil says, they shared a double bet. But they became intimate friends. And again, I use that word intimate in a non-sexual way, although nobody really knows. And as I've been talking about this book for 4 months, so many people will come up to me afterwards with their own interpretation of that. Who knows, right? But to your point, it was not uncommon, particularly for lawyers, to jump into bed with other lawyers as you were riding the circuit. And there weren't a lot of Holiday Inns and there weren't a lot of, Marriotts to sleep in. But just to your point, I think Lincoln had so much respect for Speed from spending those 4 years together and liked the way he thought, felt that kind of comfort with him and that sense of just having shared values and shared interests despite the difference on slavery. And so right after his election, 2 weeks afterwards, one of the first meetings he has is with Speed, and he wants him to join his administration, despite the fact that he was a Democrat who probably voted for Douglas. And Speed said, I can't because I'm too rich and I don't want to give up my plantation where he had 20 slaves. But he did an enormous favor to Lincoln and to the country by keeping Kentucky in the Union as opposed to letting it secede as a border state, which is what was the fun part of the story for me.
So another president you focused in on, and I'm glad you did, because even though he's our own New Hampshire Franklin Pierce, the only president we've that's come from New Hampshire, you focused on Nathaniel Hawthorne being his friend.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know a lot about him. It really, even though obviously he's been gone for quite a long time, but you highlight the fact that he didn't even have a parade when they came back to Concord.
Concord did not like him.
And to this day, I think there's this stigma around him for obvious reasons, and people in New Hampshire know very little of him and his relationship with this author. So I thought it was great that you highlighted him. I was a little surprised, actually.
Well, I was surprised too. I had no idea. And my father-in-law, who's 95 years old, I was telling him that I was going to write this book. And he said, well, you got to write about Hawthorne and Pierce. I said, what are you talking about? He says, oh yeah, they're best friends. I said, how do you possibly know that? And he did. And it turned, so I went and did research. And sure enough, they were absolute best friends, despite the cost to each of them. I mean, that's what's so interesting, and particularly to Hawthorne, because Hawthorne, was in a community with Thoreau and Emerson and Longfellow, all of whom were very progressive by our standards today, all very anti-slavery. And Pierce, who is a senator from New Hampshire, was a Northerner who supported the institution of slavery, in part because he thought it was a constitutional right, which it was, and he thought it was the only way to keep the Union together. Hawthorne basically agreed with him. And it cost Hawthorne basically the affection of anybody in his community, to the point where when he wrote his final book in 1863, he dedicated it to a now former president, Franklin Pierce. And his publisher said, if you dedicate it, you're not going to sell any of these books. And he said, I don't care, because he loved Franklin Pierce so much. And Franklin Pierce, just to put it in context, he was a failed president, but he had lost 3 sons in quick succession, all under the age of 12. The last of whom, Benny, was the 11-year-old kid, just the love of his life, the love of it because he was the last son they had. And it's 2 months before the inauguration. And they're on a locomotive coming back from an uncle of Jane Pierce's who died. And the train derails, goes down an embankment, and Benny, their son, is decapitated before their eyes, 2 months before he takes office. Can you imagine the grief that each suffered? And so Pierce had a really hard time just being president, had a very hard time taking the oath of office because he was so bereaved. And his wife never left the second floor of the White House. She spent the entire time writing letters to her dead son and throwing them up and throwing them in the fireplace. So it was a tragic story.
Terrible story.
But like I said, one thing, Clinton, when he called me about my book, he said, I took particular interest in Franklin Pierce. You know why? He said, Pierce and I are the only 2 presidents from small states. It never occurred to me. Arkansas and New Hampshire are the 2 small states to claim a president. If you think about it.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it. We sort of think of Bill Clinton being sort of our, possibly from New Hampshire
Yeah,
too, because he
exactly.
spent so much time here.
Right.
But that's interesting.
Yeah.
From small states, it's probably, very hard to do these days.
Right. Right.
One thing that, I thought was interesting because obviously you've been in this Democratic universe, but you don't write about Obama.
I wanted to. I tried to. So I called up I did my research. I have a mutual friend with his best friend. So he gave me his number. I called him up. His name's Marty Nesbitt. If you read Promised Land, you'll see his name 9 times. And he was waiting for my phone call. And he said, I've been waiting 5 years to tell my story of my first friendship with the president. And I can't wait to tell you about it. Barack is coming to Chicago next week. We share an office in Chicago. He's going to love it. I'll call you up, hopefully with him, and we'll get this going. I've never spoken to him again. And I think the reason is, I've met Obama a number of times. I'm not a friend of his by any stretch. And he was writing his book. He just didn't want to take the time.
I think I was reading your book originally when he had his birthday party that then subsequently got a lot of press because of the fact that it was COVID and there were all these people in. And I was going through the guest list and I was thinking that a lot of these folks were sort of celebrity type people.
Yeah.
Or other people's friends, a Vernon Jordan type, he used to play with, as you mentioned in the book, but not his own. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I talked to a few people who are there. He has, the truth is about Obama is he has really good friends from Hawaii, where he grew up, where he went to high school. Not grew up, but he went to high school. And apparently the person who brought the house down at that party was his friend from high school, whom you've never heard of. So I think Obama has the capacity for really great friendships that go way back to his childhood. And Marty was a friend from Chicago, and it's great. It is a great story. I'm not sure how consequential the friendship was. If you read A Promised Land, he's there for everything. He is that example of the respite that Hillary Clinton talks about. But what I was surprised about with Obama is that the people who brought him to the White House were the people who were cut from that second list, when he had to cut it down from 500 to 250, like people like David Axelrod. You think, how could you leave David Axelrod out?
Right. Yeah. And I think Oprah decided she wasn't going to go on her own. But,
is that right?
One of the things too, if you're the friend of the president financially, you can certainly benefit.
Yes.
And, Vernon Jordan was sort of always sort of took a step back saying, I was somebody before I met Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
But certainly when people know that you're in proximity to the president, you can gain. So people do financially benefit, and Bibi would be probably one of them. But have they ever sort of revealed themselves that it was just not, they weren't as close friends as they were? They were more or less using the relationship for their financial benefit or other benefits.
I tried to avoid friendships where there was that transactional element because I was really trying to show true friendship, where it wasn't about gaining pecuniary advantage because of your friend, the president. The only example really where that comes into play is the Hawthorne Pierce, where Hawthorne writes the biography of Franklin Pierce in 1852.
Which would have been really important in 1852, because that's television today.
That
Or
is
the
television
internet.
today. Exactly. Right. And so it was the only work of nonfiction that he wrote in his lifetime. And many people thought it was actually a work of fiction because it was so glowing of this very complicated man. But it helped elect him. And then Hawthorne absolutely expected a reward for it. And he got it, which was to be appointed the second most valuable post in the Foreign Service, which was consul to Liverpool. So he made some money, got to keep writing, and he had a pretty cushy job over in Liverpool, England.
And a lot of these friends, they're either super wealthy, like Bibi Rubosa,
Right.
or they are impoverished.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Daisy was impoverished.
Yes.
But I think the true test was, did you take advantage of it? And Bibi didn't take advantage of it. I think where he failed was he enabled Nixon's worst instincts. And what I was hoping to see with my first friends is that they were able to speak that hard truth to keep their friend on the right path. And when Nixon goes to Bibi and says, I need you to raise campaign funds off the books, why didn't Bibi Rebozo say no? You don't need to do that. He had said no to Nixon when he asked if he should run for president in '67. And that's a hard thing to do if you're a first friend, because you can, as you say, gain a lot of, there's a lot of gifts being the first friend of the president. But he was so selfless that he said no. And then 2 years later, when Nixon kind of draws him into his nefarious schemes, plays right along. And as I write in my book, I think that was the reason why Nixon was ultimately impeached, because of the acceptance of that $100,000 bribe from Howard Hughes that he personally took. Rebozo wasn't for his own gain either.
When you listen to their phone conversations too, a lot of times they don't even really speak too much. They just kind of,
No.
and they would, in your book, that you talk about the fact that Nixon would go and just sit in the house the whole day and not even speak.
Yeah. I called this guy, John Dean. You may see him on CNN. He's a commentator, but I was looking for anybody who could talk to me about Nixon and Rebozo's first friendship. And I said, did you ever deal with Bibi Rebozo? He goes, I've been dying to tell this story. And he tells the story to what Neil's getting at. When Nixon became president, Bibi Rebozo still insisted on driving cars with Nixon in the passenger seat. And he insisted on driving the boat that he had. He had this like 35-foot boat that Nixon loved to be on. And the Secret Service came to John Dean, who was counsel to Nixon, and said, that's against Secret Service protocol. We need to figure out something to do. So they worked out a compromise where the Secret Service would literally sit on top of the boat while Bibi Rebozo drove it. So the first outing that they had this arrangement, they're an hour out to, I think it was on the Potomac or wherever they were. And I guess, no, it must have been in Key Biscayne. And the agent hears nothing from below. It's total silence. He's like, what's going on down there? He gets worried. So he climbs down and he peers into the stateroom and he sees two men literally sitting side by side, staring at the sea for 1 hour, not a word. So he stays down there kind of peering in, and they don't say a word for a period of another hour. Goes back up to the perch. He's like, what is going on down there? He goes back to Dean and he tells Dean the story. So Dean calls the Secret Service agent out in San Clemente, who was in charge of their walks on the beach. And he says, what do you witness when they take their walks? And he said, it's the damnedest thing. They don't say a word. But that was the genius of this friendship, because Richard Nixon was a dark, brooding man who, left to his own devices, would have just sat with a yellow legal pad and just jotted his own thoughts down all day, all night. He didn't need somebody, but he had enough emotional intelligence to know that he couldn't be left entirely alone. And he needed somebody around him, somebody physically present to take him out of that. And even though I've just described these periods of silence, the genius of B.B. Rebozo was he knew just when to interject and bring Richard Nixon back into the world. And he knew just when, to tell him the joke, the anecdote, the story, knew when to mix the martini or cook the Cuban steak to keep Nixon in the world, to keep him, away from those dark thoughts that so often pervaded his mind. And I thought, however weird it is, that was a really important role that BB played in his life.
The other aspect with a lot of these friends is they're friends before they're presidents.
Yes.
And obviously that's
Everyone
an
but
important,
one. Yeah.
because we see here at the Institute of Politics, politicians, we have them all the time, and people are coming up to them and basically saying, you're great.
Yeah.
You're wonderful. And of course, the old adage, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog.
Yeah.
And, once you're president, there's going to be plenty of people who want to be your best friend.
Yes.
But a lot of these folks go back to the early days, which is another insightful thing.
Yeah. And I wanted to find friends who long predated the president taking office, because I thought first of all, there's more to tell in the chapter, but also I think it goes to the question about, was it a transactional friendship? The one that was the close exception was Colonel House. And I'll just mention this briefly. In 1906, Woodrow Wilson has a really nasty breakup with his best friend, who was a professor at Princeton, and he was devastated by it. Now it's 1911, he's the governor of New Jersey, and he knows he's gonna run for president, and it's November of 1911. The election is 1 year away. And he, like Nixon, because he was not a very social man, he knew he needed somebody again in his life to play that role. And his daughter, and don't take it from me, his daughter said in a memoir she wrote that the two great tragedies of her father's life was the breakup of his relationship with this professor in 1906, and the failure to pass the League of Nations Treaty in the Senate. So in 1911, he goes looking for a best friend at the very same moment that Colonel House is looking for both the man and the opportunity, because he was a really ambitious Texan fixer who wanted to operate on a much larger stage in the state of Texas. And he wanted to find his person that would give him the power on a national and hopefully international stage. So a meeting is arranged at House's apartment in November of 1911. They fall in love with each other. They even use the word love. They meet a second time. And by the end of the second dinner, they have basically just become inseparable best friends. And now some people have challenged me, was that really a first friendship? You could argue that it was, they needed each other, but they did need each other, and it was expressed and manifested, I thought, in a really meaningful way, because emotionally, when his first wife dies, he needs House. House is he's the comforter in chief. And then he plays this hugely substantive role by running all these vast swaths of the government, as I say. But you could argue that the quality of that friendship was different than any of the others that long predated the friend becoming president. And in fact, they have a very nasty breakup in 1919 where Wilson cuts him out of his life. And for 20 years afterward, House spends the remaining years trying to make sense of how it all went wrong.
He never was invited to the funeral.
Wasn't even invited to the funeral.
And I think the mistake with Wilson was that he closed off all other people and let House do everything.
Right.
And as House goes through that period of the breakup, essentially, and meets subsequent presidents, I thought it was interesting. You wrote that he can't do the same thing because all these other presidents are seeking advice from many different things, not just from him. So he can't lock it up.
Exactly.
It was a critical point. I think what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple questions, if you'd be willing. And we are on doing a hybrid event because we are still going through COVID-19. And we will probably take some questions from, we have a lot of people on Zoom from the back when they collect them. But from members here, if you have a question, we have a microphone. You have a question? Let us speak into the microphone because we got to pick it up for the Zoom.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I was just wondering which friend of the people that you researched on had the, would you say had the most influence on any of the presidents?
I would say it's a close call between House, who I just was talking about, just because he ran the foreign policy of the United States, negotiated with Lloyd George and Clemenceau and the Kaiser, was a key member of the negotiating team at Versailles. I mean, nobody has ever, as I said earlier, played that kind of role over such a long period of time. But David Ormsby Gore, if you read my book, you'll see how important a role he played in helping John Kennedy think through how to message his foreign policy in the beginning and really in 1958 with his Senate campaign, then in 1960, and then he plays this critical role during the Cuban Missile Crisis and kind of helping Kennedy debate in his own head whether he should blockade or bomb Cuba, how to set the perimeter for the blockade once that was decided, how to message to the world and to the country what he was doing. I mean, David Ormsby Gore, as the British ambassador, played as important a role during those 13 days as anybody in Kennedy's foreign policy team. And then in a year later, I think really but for David Ormsby Gore, Kennedy probably would have never pursued and signed that limited nuclear test ban treaty, which was in some ways the most important piece of treaty that he signed in his entire presidency and helped accelerate the end of the Cold War. So I think those two, there's one other example where it wasn't over a period of time, but was one moment. And I haven't mentioned Harry Truman yet, but his best friend walked into the Oval Office in March of 1948 and convinced Harry Truman to meet with a British citizen who was the leading Zionist advocate in the world. And Truman wasn't going to meet with this man. And if it weren't for his best friend flying halfway across the country, walking up the driveway of the White House, marching into his office and saying, you have to see this man. And you have to see him, and invoking things from his past that he knew would get Truman to break the logjam in his brain and see this man. I don't think Truman would have recognized the state of Israel upon its founding. And it had huge consequences for that bilateral, or that, that alliance that now exists between Israel and the United States. And so I think for a moment in time, in terms of a friend changing history, that was probably the most consequential moment.
Another question? Yes.
I was wondering, well, obviously you found enough information to be able to write about each of the relationships in the book, but I was wondering if there's any in particular that were really difficult to find insight on.
Yeah. Yeah, the first, Kennedy Ormsby Gore was tough. And it took me a while. Caroline was right that you had to kind of dig for it. He only gave one interview to the Kennedy Library, one oral interview. There was another best friend of Kennedy's who gave 14 hours, just by contrast. So, I had to dig. Libraries were closed during a good chunk of my research. So thank God for my Mac computer and a really robust amount of material about presidents. And presidential libraries are so good today. And I had a lot of friends who kind of chipped in, and one guy who tried to convince me to do a chapter on Warren Harding eventually turned me to Colonel House, because I didn't really know anything about Colonel House. And then he sent me all of House's diaries, which he had, for some reason, he had all of them mimeographed. So he was sending me, just huge packages of House's diary, which was essential for really understanding that friendship. A couple of them, there was a book about Speed and Lincoln, which made that much more, kind of gave me a guidepost. And Daisy Suckley, no one would have known her role in Roosevelt's life until they discovered a trunk underneath her bed after she died in her 100th year. And Jeffrey Ward, a great historian of Roosevelt, actually took them and put them all into a book along with her letters. So I had all of that material to work with and to put my own interpretation on. And then I called Jeffrey Ward. I mean, what was so great and what I learned writing this book is that presidential historians, and I don't consider myself a presidential historian by any stretch compared to these giants, but they were all so willing to read my draft and give me comments, give me feedback, give me their interpretations. I had some of the great historians of our generation actually reading it, which for me was such a thrill, whether it was Beschloss or David Greenberg for Nixon, Jeffrey Ward for Roosevelt. I had a professor at Brown who was in Charles New, who wrote the seminal biography of Colonel House. And I had hours of conversations with Chuck New. It was just so much fun for me.
Another question. You have a question? Yes. Right down right here in the front. Oh. One from Zoom.
This question is from Zoom. This question is from Zoom. If you wrote a sequel, what friends might you cover next?
Yeah, that's the big debate is, do I do a second volume? Because I probably could, because there's enough, I probably have another 9 stories if I wanted to. The one friendship I would really most want to write, if I had to pick one, is Joe Biden's friendship. When I finished the book, it was right when Biden was taking the oath. So I obviously couldn't do the friendship, but I asked around and I found his first friend. His name is Ted Kaufman, and he lives in Wilmington, Delaware. And I struck up a real friendship with him where I started talking to him on the phone. And he would never go on record with me. He never wanted to describe himself as first friend, but he is. He was his chief of staff for 22 years. He also lived in Wilmington, so he used to take the Acela with Biden every day. So he got to really know him. And he didn't tell me this story, but but somebody gave me friends to call to get a better sense of their friendship. And one person told me the most touching story about their friendship. In 2015, Bo was dying, and it's April, and Biden did not want to go through that alone. So he calls up Ted and he says, would you take a 120-day special government employee designation, unpaid, and just come to Washington and just be here with me? And Ted didn't miss a beat, got right on the train, came down, took an office in the executive office building, and he just was there. Whenever Biden wanted to come over and, just unburden himself, cry on his shoulder, talk to him, go out for a meal, Ted was just there. And Bo dies the next month. He stays another 3 months. And friends say that he was enormously helpful at the most difficult period in Biden's life. And I just think it's such a sign of really genuine friendship. And it's fascinating because I've picked up so much more. He was the only first non-family member to sleep in the White House. He spent 4 days when Jill was taking her first trip away from Washington. He sat in on all the meetings except for the national intelligence briefing, foreign intelligence briefing. But he said to me, I do not get involved in policy decisions because the issues have become so complex that I don't feel qualified to opine. Obviously, if the president says, what do you think, how am I doing? What do you think about this? He's got to at least give a sense. But he said, when it gets to the president's desk today, that means that 5,000 other people couldn't make that decision. And he said, not being privy to the flow of information, I don't feel qualified. So I don't want to be making decisions anymore. I want to just be a friend.
Gary, I think you have your sequel.
Yeah.
Because that is a great story.
Yeah.
Another person we haven't heard about and obviously has a big impact right now. So that's quite interesting. You have a question.
I was wondering if you could say anything about, is there a kind of significant difference between kind of researching biographical information about a president versus these friends?
Yes. Yeah. Well, Vernon, for example, he wrote a memoir, but no one's written a book about Vernon Jordan. But the benefit, I will say, it was much easier in a sense to do the Clinton chapter because everybody was alive. The only chapter where I could play the role of both journalist and historian. And so to be able to to ask the president who his friend was, to have, a 2-hour interview with him, an hour interview with his wife. I talked to Vernon for 3 hours off the record. He wrote his memoir and ended it in 1992. And he said, Gary, there's a reason why I ended in 92. And that's because I'm going to tell the story of my friendship with Bill Clinton, not you. And I said, Vernon, I totally respect that. A year later, he had a stroke, and this past March, he died. So he was unfortunately never able to get to it. So I felt a real special responsibility to tell that story accurately and well. And hopefully I did that. The friends, look, Hawthorne, there's a fair amount written about Hawthorne. There was a lot written about both Jefferson and Madison. Speed, there was a book, as I said, and then I kind of went beyond the book to find my own material. Gore, there was nothing. Gore was tough. Gore was, you really had to kind of dig around, and it was really books about the relationship between the U.S. and England, where he's mentioned a fair amount, but they're obscure books for the most part. Bibi Rebozo, you guys are all too young. You probably remember him, don't you? Do you remember him at all?
Not really.
You're
but
probably younger than I am. I guess you're much younger than I am. But if you're your late 50s as I am, and you were a student of presidents at the age of 10, Bibi Rebozo was a huge figure because he was always around. So he became an object of fascination to me. There really has been nothing written about him, but there's tapes, as Neil mentions. There's a lot of books where he plays, a very small role. But if you get 20 books about Nixon and you pull the 1 or 2 mentions from each of those books, you can create a portrait, which is what I hopefully did.
I always thought that Bibi was there also because he had the money.
You did.
And, Nixon wants to go down to Florida.
Yes.
And he's staying at the Florida White House, essentially.
Yes. Although he bought that house. Nixon bought the house that became the Florida White House. I went to see it, actually. It's now that, anyone see the movie Scarface?
Yeah.
It's the Scarface.
Well, they're too
house.
young.
Yeah, it's an Al Pacino movie. Where they filmed Scarface is where Nixon's Winter White House was, which is where Bibi's house was, and then his house was next door. But Bibi, as I write, was probably a member of the mob and had all kinds of nefarious connections, which is why he probably did all the dirty things for Nixon, because he was predisposed.
Another question? I think we have time for about 2 more. Yes.
So I'm sure you know that St. Anselm College is definitely a school that attracts many politics majors. So for politics majors, would you have any advice? What would be the best lesson from the book you would abstract, that students could abstract for their careers in terms of who they make friends with?
That's a question I've not ever.
Don't go to work for Gary Hart in '88. Right?
Yeah, don't go to work for Gary Hart. Yes. So in terms of if you're politically ambitious, how you choose your friends, is that essentially what you're asking? My advice to you is not pick friends based on ambition. Pick friends who you genuinely adore, who share your interests, share your values, have your back, are rooting for you, want only the best for you. And then good things will come to you from having good friends. I know in my own life, I'm certainly not a politician. I'm never going to be president of the United States, despite my ambition as a 10-year-old to be the president of the United States. But I think my friends have been enormously helpful to me in grounding me, in making me a better person, in guiding me in all the kind of moments in my life when I was at an inflection point and had to make a decision. And I got such great advice from my friends at every point. And so I think if you develop genuine good friendships, good things will come to you.
Now, that's a little bit different than Bill Clinton, though, because he was, as you write about in the book, he's at
Yeah.
Oxford, and he's got a little black book. and
Yeah.
He's writing everybody's
Yeah.
biographical information so he can sort of collect friends.
Right.
But interesting, we're in New Hampshire, and he made a lot of friends here in New Hampshire. And even to this day, you hear someone will go in the hospital being sick or something happens and the phone rings and it's Bill Clinton checking up on his
Yeah.
old friend. It's legendary in this state, the friendships that man made.
Yeah. And well, listen, if you're politically ambitious, you generally are socially gregarious. You're generally, type A. You generally have an ease with making friends because that's so important to being a politician, is the ability to give of yourself. I mean, but look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump never had a first friend, was constitutionally incapable of having a first friend. And I think it's interesting because to have a good friend, you have to give of yourself, right? You have to show compassion. You have to show emotion. You have to show curiosity. You have to be willing to listen, because it can't just be a one-way street. He couldn't do any of that. And yet he became president of the United States. So, what's interesting is that 2 of my 9 presidents were social misfits, essentially. I would say both Nixon and Wilson, yet they became presidents. But they had one friend. And I think that friend, in both cases, helped the president become president. But yet, to Neil's point, yeah, you should be very open to all kinds of people. And, being gregarious and friendly is a good thing if you're politically ambitious.
Time for one more question right here in the front.
Hi, I remember you had mentioned that you were struck by this idea on a particular day and that you said, like, I have to write this book. I was wondering what kind of specifically inspired that, and was there any particular works that maybe inspired this?
Well, it's funny, Neil and I were talking about this before I came out here. I worked for some pretty powerful people in my life as kind of a right-hand man to these people. And I think part of the inspiration for this was my relationship with them and seeing both their own friends and seeing the role that I played. I was by no means first friend to Rupert Murdoch. I wasn't best friends with John Kennedy. But I saw the role of friendship in their lives. I saw the importance of being able to speak that hard truth to people in positions of power. I think John Kennedy, when he started his political magazine, the Son of the President, and you guys are too young, but he was a real celebrity. I mean, on par with a Lady Diana in England. And he wanted somebody around him in the magazine that he just felt comfortable with, who could tell him what was up and what was down, and then could run off from the magazine headquarters and go play Frisbee in the park and just give him that respite. And I think part of why I came to this idea, and what was bizarre for me, is that no one's ever written this book before. There's been books about first wives and first pets and first chefs and first butlers, and no one's ever looked at the presidency through the lens of a best friend. And I guess I had seen it both in my own, looking at Trump not having a first friend, seeing Warren Beatty play the role for Gary Hart, seeing Vernon Jordan and watching him with Bill Clinton, and then working for powerful people, as I say. And I just think I had kind of subconsciously taken in the importance that friend can play, both in the rise to power and then in the exercise of power. And I just thought it would be a nice and interesting way to understand our presidents through that friendship. And hopefully, I accomplished it with my book.
You certainly did, and we really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
This is a fascinating subject, and congratulations on
Thank you.
being on the New York Times bestseller list.
Thank you.
We have a 3,000 volume presidential library here. Arthur Young writes books on libraries, and created this collection on his own.
Oh,
It was
wow.
His own collection. And so maybe sometime you'll come back and we can lend you some books. And
I
we
would
can
love
do
to.
some research here at the Institute of Politics.
Well, it's a real honor I was looking at all the people who've come here and sat in these chairs, and it's a real honor to be part of that roster of writers and politicians and leaders. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks, everybody.